Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first of what we hope will become a regular monthly lunchtime talk organised by the 1745 Association on topics of Jacobite interest. This has been a difficult year when, for circumstances beyond our control, we have been unable to organise our usual programme of events. But humans are infinitely adaptable, and when one door closes, another one opens, and the stimulus provided by the COVID lockdown has encouraged us to organise this online event. And hopefully, as we come out of the crisis in 2021, we will be able to combine a monthly online talk with a physical programme of events when we can meet face to face once more. It's particularly appropriate that this inaugural talk is being given in January 2021, as it is 275 years since the tragic and accidental death of the youngest colonel in the Jacobite army of 1745, Young Glengarry. And it is equally appropriate that this first talk is being given by Glen MacDonald, former vice chairman of the association, as it was Glen who put in the hard work to successfully organise a plaque to his memory at the entrance to the Trinity Church in Falkirk, on Falkirk High Street, where young Glengarry was laid to rest almost 3 centuries ago. And so, it is with great pleasure that I invite Glen to speak to us today.
Thank you very much indeed, Mike, for those introductory words, and also thank you to yourself and the association for giving me the opportunity to provide the inaugural talk in the series of talks that you've just described. So many thanks. So the title of my talk today is After the Battle of Falkirk, the Death of Young Glengarry, in which I'm going to tell you an interesting tale about a little cameo event which happened on the fringes of bigger events in connection with the Battle of Falkirk, which took place on the 17th of January, 1746. By way of providing some context to the story of the death of young Glengarry, I should perhaps just very briefly set the scene by telling you briefly about the events of the previous day, namely the 17th, when the battle took place. It was a battle, of course, between the Hanoverian British government forces commanded by General Henry Hawley and the Jacobite army of Prince Charles Edward Stuart, or as we more commonly know him, Bonnie Prince Charlie. The battle took place on the high ground above and to the south of Falkirk, and it took place in the late afternoon and early mid-evening, and in fact it took place in terrible conditions of weather, storms, hail, gales, rain, you name it. It was dreadful weather in which to fight a battle. But by the end of the day, to cut a long story short, the Jacobites prevailed. Although it was touch and go here and there, now and again, the Jacobites prevailed, and Bonnie Prince Charlie's army was victorious. And the government army of General Hawley withdrew in some considerable distress and disarray from the field. The army dispersed eastwards towards Linlithgow and on to Edinburgh in a state of defeat and almost panic, and leaving behind their artillery, their baggage train, and many of their arms, munitions and accoutrements, and that part of the tale is significant in relation to the story I'm going to now relate to you. So that's the scene set. That's what happened on the day before, and Bonnie Prince Charlie's army, following the battle, occupied the town of Falkirk. But what I'm going to describe to you now is what happened on the day after the battle, on the 18th of January 1746. And you can see here a picture of Falkirk, painted around about this time, when Falkirk was not a large town as we would know it today, but probably what we would know today as a large village. And that's how it looked at this time. And indeed, central to that picture, you can see two buildings, two prominent buildings. On the left, you've got the old Trinity, old parish church on the High Street in Falkirk, where young Glengarry is laid to rest. And on the right hand side, you can see the Tolbooth with its distinctive tower. And in fact, it is in that location between those two prominent buildings where all of the events that I'm about to describe pretty much took place, in that small area you see there. So on the day after the battle, the weather improved, the sun came out, probably still a bit chilly as it tends to be in Scotland at this time of year, but nevertheless it was a brighter, more cheerier day. And so the soldiers of Bonnie Prince Charlie's army got out of wherever they'd been able to find billets the night before, late when they got into Falkirk, no doubt in people's houses, and went outside, stretched their limbs, and thought about the aftermath of the battle and what it would mean for them. And here's another picture of Falkirk, illustrated probably a few years after the events I'm going to describe, but nevertheless giving a pretty good and accurate depiction of what Falkirk looked like in the mid to late 18th century. And indeed, I know Falkirk quite well myself, and I can tell you, interestingly, that the High Street looks pretty much like that today. Obviously, there's different shop frontages, but the aspect is remarkably similar to that which you would find were you to be walking the High Street today. And this is the locus of where all these events took place. And in the middle there, or to the right, you can see the Tolbooth with its tower that I mentioned earlier on. So the young gentleman who was shot and mortally wounded, young Glengarry, was walking along the High Street on the right-hand side of the picture there, on the south side of the street. And on the opposite side of the street, you can see some buildings there on the north side. And as young Glengarry was walking along the street, on the left-hand side, from one of those upper windows, a musket appeared from out of the window and fired. The musket ball that came from the barrel shot across and downwards over to the other side of the street and struck young Glengarry in his upper torso through his back, damaging his spine, and as we will see, resulted ultimately in his death. He was mortally wounded and fell there and then. Those are the bald facts of what happened, but there's a much wider story to tell about this, but it happened right there in that street, as you can see there. First of all, though, before I go on to describe the wider circumstances surrounding that shooting and its implications, we must perhaps first of all think about who young Glengarry was and why it was important. Well, his actual title was Colonel Aeneas MacDonald of Glengarry, known as Young Glengarry. He was, in fact, the youngest colonel in the Jacobite army of Bonnie Prince Charlie. He was the second son of John, known as Old Glengarry, 12th chief of the MacDonalds of Glengarry. He was 20 years old. As you'll see there in the third bullet point, he was commanding the Glengarry Regiment. Why was he commanding the Glengarry Regiment? Well, first of all, his father, Old Glengarry, as his name would suggest, was really too old and infirm to be bearing the hardships of military campaigning. And so, as would normally be the case with clan chiefs in this time and before this time, they would delegate command of the clan regiment to normally their oldest son. In this case, the older brother, the oldest son, as you see in the second bullet there, was Alistair Ruag MacGoyle, or in English, red-haired Alistair MacDonald. He, in fact, however, like as was quite common amongst the Jacobite clan gentry of the time, he'd spent quite a bit of time in France and was in France when the rising occurred. He was serving in a unit of the French army, staffed mostly by Scots in the Royal Écossais, which had been formed a year or two earlier in anticipation of a Jacobite rising in Scotland. So the oldest son was abroad in France at the time. In fact, he had been back to Scotland earlier in 1745 on a secret mission to warn the clan chiefs that there was to be a rising, and he'd come back to France. But after the rising started, his regiment was sent by sea to Scotland to join the rising, but alas, it was intercepted at sea by the Royal Navy in December 1745, and the soldiers of the regiment were taken prisoner, including the older brother, Alistair Ruig, and he, in fact, was imprisoned in the Tower of London for the remainder of the campaign. In fact, interestingly, after the rising came to an end, after the Battle of Culloden, many of the clan chiefs and principal people were arrested by the government. Old Glengarry was one of them, and he joined his oldest son in the Tower of London in captivity for a time. So that's why young Glengarry, who was on the face of it only 20 years old, found himself at that young age in a position of great responsibility, commanding his father's clan regiment in the army of Bonnie Prince Charlie. The slide says there he was 20 years old, but in fact, I've seen some evidence recently to suggest that he might have been a little bit older than that, that he might have been born in 1719, which would put him at 25 maybe, or thereabouts. Interestingly, about the same age as Bonnie Prince Charlie himself. In any event, we know him to be a young man, 20 to 25 years old. He was married and had a son who was born in 1745, an infant with the name of Duncan. And we know that Duncan went on, actually, some years later, as a young man himself, to become the 14th chief of the MacDonalds of Glengarry, in succession to his uncle Alistair Ruig. So that's his kind of background. He, the Glengarry Regiment had been raised by Donald MacDonald of Lochgarry, who was the chief's cousin, but titular command had been given at the start of the rising to young Glengarry. The regiment had joined the Prince and come south, and it fought at the Battle of Prestonpans, and young Glengarry commanded the regiment at that battle, and by all accounts commanded it well, acquitted himself well, despite his youth and inexperience. He was a well-respected, very young commanding officer of the regiment, supported, of course, by other clan gentry in the regiment's officer corps. Following Prestonpans, he and another of his kinsmen, Cole MacDonald of Barrisdale, went back up into the Highlands in order to raise more men, to recruit more men in the clan lands of Glengarry and further west, in order to further augment Bonnie Prince Charlie's army with the provision of a 2nd battalion of Glengarry MacDonalds. And indeed, they did do that. And after the regiment returned to Scotland, following the army's procession down to Derby and the events that took place there, and the retreat from Derby via Carlisle and Glasgow, etc., when the army came back to central Scotland, young Glengarry joined the regiment again and formed it into 2 battalions and took command again. 1 battalion being commanded by Donald MacDonald of Lochgarry, the chief's cousin, and the 2nd battalion commanded by Cole MacDonald of Barrisdale, a very interesting character in his own right, actually. In fact, not to put too fine a point on it, he was a bit of a crook, and nowadays we'd call him a bit of a mafia boss. He ran a blackmail and protection racket on the west coast of Scotland in the Western Highlands, and was a bit of a shady character. And subsequently was arrested, actually, after the rising by the Jacobites when he fled to France. So a bit of a turncoat and an interesting character in his own right. I've been to his house, actually, on the shores of Kinlochhourn, where he maintained an imprisonment type of machine, a form of stocks to put people into when the tide lapped about their necks, for those that had aroused his dislike. So quite an interesting character. So The regiment was formed, as I say, into 2 battalions and was up to 12,000 strong. In fact, some reports I've read indicate that, in fact, there were 1,500 men in the regiment within these 2 battalions. So worth making the point that it was a significant unit of considerable size within the battle order of Bonnie Prince Charlie's army, which was maybe about 8,500 strong at the Battle of Falkirk. So 1,200 to 1,500 is significant. Perhaps even more significant when you consider that they formed an even greater proportion of the front line of the Jacobite army, the shock troops, mostly the Highland clan regiments, who unleashed the fabled and famous Highland charge upon enemies, and they did it indeed in that day with the MacDonalds, various regiments of MacDonalds on the right of the line of battle, as was their right. So a significant unit of some considerable military significance within Bonnie Prince Charlie's army, commanded by this very young, 20 or so years old young man, Colonel Aeneas MacDonald of Glengarry. So how did the shooting of him in the street on the day after the battle come about? Well, in the wake of the battle, as I mentioned, Hawley's troops pretty much abandoned their accoutrements and weapons, or many of them did, as they fled in disarray eastwards towards Edinburgh. And they abandoned many of their weapons. And many of them, of course, as you would imagine, were picked up and taken as spoils of war by the Jacobite army. And one such incident was that a clansman in the MacDonald of Clanranald Regiment, think about him as this man you see in the right of your picture here, typically in 18th century Highland dress, he had captured a government musket the day before as a spoil of war. And he'd taken it with him into Falkirk late that night after the battle, found himself some lodgings just off the High Street, got his head down, and in the morning when he woke up, got himself going, like many other Jacobite soldiers that morning, he got up and got on with his day. And his day consisted of, to start with, making safe what he thought was making safe the musket that he had captured. So the musket in question was the Brown Bess, standard pattern musket weapon issued to soldiers in the British Army at this time, and indeed for many years after this. The Brown Bess, it looked like this, with a flintlock like that. And it fired a musket ball like this, as you see between the grubby finger and thumb, forefinger and thumb on that photograph on the right. It's a .75 caliber musket ball, or in new money, 19 millimeters, and does considerable damage to people when struck within about 100 yards or 110 yards of this weapon, which was more or less its effective range. So this Clanranald soldier had a weapon such as this. He'd taken it the day before, and he found that it was loaded. So the first thing to do was, as we say, to make the weapon safe. And he did that by extracting with a tool, special tool, the musket ball from the barrel. Thinking that the weapon was now safe, i.e. not loaded, he pointed it out of the window and into the street. He then pulled the trigger in order to, as he thought, to harmlessly discharge the weapon of its wadding and gunpowder, which he thought was the only thing left down there in the barrel. And that would be quite a normal thing to do, although you would normally point it in a safe direction, just in case. But he didn't. He just thrust the weapon out of the window into the street and pulled the trigger, thinking that it would just be the wadding and gunpowder. But to his great surprise and horror, there was an unexpected recoil, which he felt sharply in his right shoulder, and a second ball, which had been in the barrel, was shot into the street, propelled across to the other side of the street and downwards, and struck young Glengarry, mortally wounding him, struck him in the upper torso and went through his spine by all accounts, and gave him significant injuries, of which he eventually passed away. he'd been walking on the other side of the street, as I mentioned, with other officers. In short, the musket had been double shotted, and the Clanranald private soldier had not realised that. Now, there could be a couple of explanations as to why it was double shotted. I mean, it would be normal just to have one musket ball in the weapon and to load it with one ball for firing. But on occasions, I understand, two musket balls were rammed into the barrel, perhaps if it was to be used at shorter range in order to increase the likelihood of the shooter actually hitting a target with at least one of the balls. But perhaps a more likely explanation has been given to our association, has been given by our association member, Paul MacDonald, who's an 18th century weapons expert. And he has explained to us that in all likelihood, it had been loaded with a second ball by mistake. Quite often, as you can imagine, soldiers in the British Army firing under orders, i.e. not firing at will, but firing in unison with each other on the orders of their NCOs and officers. And it may be that because the day before the battle was fought in very wet conditions, that the mechanism, the cocking mechanism and touch hole of the weapon to put the spark through into the powder had got damp, clogged with water or hail or something, and that when the trigger had been pulled the day before, it hadn't actually discharged. But because soldiers either side had discharged their weapons, there was a cacophony of noise. The soldier holding this particular weapon may not have realized that it hadn't actually discharged in the heat of the moment with noise, etc. And he probably reloaded the weapon thinking that there wasn't a ball in it and there were two. Perhaps it misfired again, but for whatever reason, it was left on the battlefield in that state with two balls, picked up by the Clanranald soldier and taken down into Falkirk, but only one of the musket balls had been extracted. So what happened then? Well, young Glengarry obviously dropped, having been shot through the torso. He was carried by his fellow officers to his lodgings in Burns Court, which was a little courtyard just behind and off the south side of the High Street, on the right-hand side of the picture I showed you earlier on. And here in front of you is a photograph taken of Burns Court, obviously later on sometime in the 19th century. And it is perhaps likely that young Glengarry was taken to one of these two buildings, which would certainly have been there in the 18th century. And he was taken into one of these buildings in order to be tended to. So he was taken in there. In fact, interestingly, the site of Burns Court is now encapsulated within the footprint of Marks and Spencer's in Falkirk on the south side of the High Street, as you can see there. But things move on, things change, and since in the recent years, Marks and Spencer's itself has closed in Falkirk, but Burns Court was in there. So what happened then? Well, whilst Glengarry was being taken to his lodgings in Burns Court, the MacDonalds of Glengarry gathered in the street, and word quickly spread that their young commanding officer, their chief's second son, had been shot in the street, and they became angry and agitated, and a number of them dashed up the stairs in this building where the soldier had fired the shot from and laid hands on him, and no doubt gave him a rough time of it, dragged him into the street, and were outraged that this soldier from a sister regiment had, as they perhaps saw it in the heat of the moment, attempted to murder their commanding officer, and they demanded eye for an eye justice. They demanded the right to take him away there and then and execute him for his deed as the perpetrator of the shooting. So in the meantime, the soldier's commanding officer, who wasn't in fact Clanranald himself, it was Clanranald's eldest son, who was commanding the Clanranald Regiment, he was called for and came with some of his clansmen, and a bit of an uproar took place. You know, a bit of a dilemma ensued, and it rapidly became apparent to Clanranald, that he was on the horns of a dilemma. Why? Because if he permitted his clansmen to be dragged away by clansmen of another clan, albeit another Clandonald clan, and summarily executed, then that would be seen as an insult to his clan and regiment, bearing in mind that the man had not been given any kind of a trial to see what had actually happened. So he thought it would be an affront and an insult to him, his clan and his regiment, if they were allowed to do that. On the other hand, if he didn't allow them to do that, then the MacDonalds of Glengarry would be incensed and irked in the extreme and annoyed and disaffected to such an extent that the heart would go out of their efforts in support of Bonnie Prince Charlie's army, and they may withdraw from the army and removing a significant portion of its fighting strength. It was a real dilemma. Bonnie Prince Charlie and his staff became involved as well, and deliberations were undertaken as to how best to resolve this situation. But in the end, a compromise was struck that it was believed would give due honour to all parties and ensure that the matter could be put to rest without either of these two clans being totally disaffected. And the compromise was that, yes, he would be executed for perpetrating this deed, whether it was accidental or not, but that the Clanranald would execute him themselves. So Clanranald formed a firing squad, a depiction of which you can see here, depicted by reenactors. The man was taken to a place called the Cladden's Wall, in the major estate Callendar House at the edge of the town, which incidentally belonged of the Earl of Kilmarnock, who was also a senior officer in Bonnie Prince Charlie's army, coincidentally. The man was taken there, a firing squad was formed, and interestingly, the firing squad contained one particular Clanranald Highlander. Let's call him this man you see on the right here, who's another reenactor. And this was the man who was to be executed's father, would you believe? And this man, the soldier's father, wanted to be part of the firing squad, which was tasked with executing his own son, because he wanted to ensure that if he had to die, his son would die instantly, and he would make sure of it. What a dreadful thing for any father to have to do, but did it. He did that, and the man was executed. So where did that leave the situation in Young Glengarry? Well, having been initially attended by the regimental surgeons, Young Glengarry lay in agony in his lodgings for 2-3 days, exactly how many days and nights, we're not entirely sure, but roughly 3 days, in great pain. And it seems that in terms of the nowadays, as a battlefield injury, he probably could have been saved, but the extent of medical capability at the time was such that his injury was too serious, and not much could be done for him other than to keep him comfortable, tend his wound, etc., and see whether he recovered. But in fact, he was for a time lucid and compos mentis, and much and greatly to his credit, on hearing about the plight of the Clanranald man who had accidentally shot him, he had declared himself satisfied that the man was innocent, and very commendably and honourably and magnanimously asked that no harm should come to him. But as we've seen, with the Glengarry men, the red mist had come up for them, and they demanded justice, and we have seen that eventually Clanranald's men executed the shooter themselves. Eventually, after 3 painful days and nights, young Glengarry passed away on around about the 21st or 22nd of January 1746 in his lodgings in Burns Court. Now, I think the important thing to do now is to consider these events in a wider context and consider what their ramifications were. And in order to understand the ramifications, I think we have to consider what was going on in terms of the wider strategic picture with Bonnie Prince Charlie's army and rising in general at that time. So the context here is that in the immediate wake of the Battle of Falkirk, the Jacobite High Command was divided into two camps, eventually geographically, because Bonnie Prince Charlie and his staff went to Bannockburn House near Stirling, and the rump of the army, along with its operational command, Lord George Murray, and the Highland chiefs and regimental commanding officers in Falkirk, it settled that way. Initially, though, after the battle, Lord George Murray and the commanding officers, the senior officers, wanted to press their advantage, having won this battle. They wanted to pursue warfare of speed and maneuver. They wanted to pursue the fleeing remnants of Hawley's army through Falkirk, through Linlithgow, capturing prisoners and ensuring that the army couldn't reform, and above all, retaking Edinburgh, retaking Scotland's capital, to gain some strategic advantage out of the battle that they just won, which seems entirely sensible and reasonable. On the other hand, the Prince's party and his staff saw things differently. They didn't initially want to undertake the course of action I've just explained, because they wanted the army to remain in and around Falkirk, Stirling area in order to proceed with the siege of Stirling Castle, which had been underway for some time before the battle. The thinking being that Stirling Castle was a strategic place and feature which should be captured and surrendered so that it didn't hinder their connections and passage of men and resources up to the north of Scotland and the Highlands, which at the time was their power base. Although the other side of the command felt that that was really unnecessary and that Stirling Castle could simply be bypassed, and that as long as the army kept out of the artillery range from the castle, then it could do no real harm. So it was decided that the army would stay and do that and continue with the siege of Stirling Castle under a French engineer that they had working with them. Meantime, in Falkirk, the army was becoming a bit restive for quite a few days whilst it frankly hung about Falkirk. And importantly, the town of Falkirk and its immediate hinterland and environment, it rapidly became apparent that it couldn't really support, 6,000 to 8,000 men billeted on what was really a large village. There just wasn't enough accommodation, shelter, food, drink to support such a large army, and that meant that, quite frankly, the lower echelons of the army were going hungry. Not only that, they felt that in hanging about in a place where they could not get proper support, they'd lost impetus and they lost momentum, and in many ways the army began to lose heart, and that manifests itself in the form of increasing desertions. Increasingly large numbers of men were slipping away northwards through the night to desert the army and return to their clan lands with perhaps whatever booty they'd managed to acquire during the course of that date. So the army was beginning to atrophy and lose heart, lose momentum, lose fighting spirit. In the meantime, crucially, Lord George Murray was getting intelligence from Edinburgh that the opposite was happening to Hawley's government army. It was gaining in strength. It was reforming itself. It was using the resources available to it in Edinburgh to rearm itself, to feed itself, to reform itself, to regain its composure. Additional units came up from the south to augment the size of the army. Stragglers came back in that had been missing over the last period and reformed their reformed into their units. They started drilling again. They started regaining confidence. Not only that, the Duke of Cumberland, the king's son, came north and joined the government army on the 30th of January to take command from Hawley. And he was a well-respected officer in the government army, much liked by the common soldier, and that would have given a shot in the arm to the confidence and spirit that was abounding in the government army as it regained its confidence and strength in Edinburgh. And it didn't need anybody with a great brain to realise that sooner or later that government army would move westwards again to confront the Jacobites. But in the meantime, the Jacobites were in a declining position, as I have suggested. So this greatly concerned Lord George Murray and the senior officers around him. And this resulted in a very bad-tempered exchange of missives between them on the one hand and Bonnie Prince Charlie in Bannockburn House on the other, and an exchange of emissaries was sent back and forth to debate what exactly should be done. And eventually Lord George Murray and the Highland chiefs and the principal commanding officers recommended that the army, because of its state, should retreat northwards into the Highlands to regroup for the remainder of the winter. And indeed, that is exactly what happened. In a somewhat ragged way, on the fringes of proper command and control, the army eventually bolted north to the fords of Frew and northwards. So that was the wider picture that was unfolding in these days after the battle, in the period between which young Glengarry was shot and he eventually died, and the ill feeling that generated. So what effect did this little cameo incident have upon that wider strategic picture that I've just described to you? Well, the ramifications were, first of all, that young Glengarry's death sowed divisions between the two Clandonald regiments, two significant units at the teeth fighting edge of the force, and fueled a deterioration in morale and contributed towards desertions. You know, perhaps worth bearing in mind, you know, that that clan regiments didn't just have a commanding officer; they had either their clan chief or one of his principal sons, and there was a great feeling of affinity for it, not in all cases, but certainly amongst the officer corps. And having lost their commanding officer, they were dispirited and began to desert in increasing numbers, on top of, for the reasons I've just described. Also, many refused to believe that the shooting was an accident. You know, conspiracy theories, you know, abounded up and down the High Street in Falkirk in the Gaelic tongue, to the suggestion that he'd actually been deliberately murdered, and people were wondering why he'd been murdered. You know, this was a scene of subterfuge and ill feeling abroad following his shooting. But as we've seen, young Glengarry eventually passed away on the 22nd of January, and he was laid to rest. And I'm going to show you shortly where he was laid to rest, in the graveyard, in the churchyard of Trinity Old Parish Church in Falkirk. And a funeral was held for him. Lord George Murray and all of the clan chiefs and commanding officers and senior officers of the army attended the funeral, but we know that Bonnie Prince Charlie did not attend the funeral. He failed to attend, and that was seen as a considerable snub by the clan chiefs, who were greatly affected by that, and thought it was a disgrace that Bonnie Prince Charlie had not attended. And so that contributed towards the feeling of ill will towards the prince and his staff. In fact, we know that Bonnie Prince Charlie was ill at the time. He was laid up in bed with something like a very bad cold or flu or pneumonia, something like that. We'll never know exactly what he was suffering from, but it was something of that nature. To what extent he was ill, we don't know. He was being tended by the woman that eventually went on in later years to become his mistress, Clementina Walkinshaw, who I think was the daughter of the owner of Bannockburn House. Now, I think, and this is just my own personal opinion, that if he was well enough to attend, notwithstanding the fact that he had a terrible cold, if that was the case, then I think if he'd been of a right mind, he would have realised that, in fact, it was in his best interest to attend in order to ensure the cohesion of his army. But for whatever reason, he didn't attend, and I think that contributed greatly towards the feeling of unhappiness amongst the army and the division between the two camps. In a way, therefore, I think the death of young Glengarry and its aftermath contributed towards the eventual decision for the Jacobite army to retreat north into the Highlands. And that was a significant strategic event in the history of the Rising, the retreat north into the Highlands rather than to remain in the central belt. And perhaps arguably was, perhaps eventually led to the way in which the Rising came to an end and the situation the army found itself in at Culloden, etc. And although young Glengarry's death wasn't the linchpin driving force behind what happened, I think it played a significant part in those wider proceedings that led to this situation. So I'd say that this is a significant event in the wider context, even although on the face of it, it's a small cameo incident that happened the day after the battle. So an interesting debate. So where was young Glengarry laid to rest? Well, he was laid to rest in that sarcophagus that you see in the photograph on the left-hand side of your picture there, in the churchyard of Falkirk Trinity Old Parish Church. The wrought ironwork you can see around it, I think, was erected in later years, but you'll see within it a stone sarcophagus. And young Glengarry was put in there. But in fact, that's not his grave. It is the tomb of John de Graham, one of Robert the Bruce's lieutenants, who was killed during the earlier Battle of Falkirk, many centuries beforehand, and was opened up in order for young Glengarry to be buried within it, where he lies to this day. Now, I knew the story that I've just described to you quite well. I visit Falkirk fairly regularly, and I was in the town one day, and I was on the high street, and I thought to myself, well, young Glengarry was shot here. The man who shot him was out of one of these windows on this side of the street here. He was taken to Burns Court in Marks and Spencer's, and he died 3 days later, and he was buried here in this grave on the other side, behind the other side of the high street here. And all of those things happened within a circumference of about 100 or 150 yards. And I looked around and I thought, there's nothing here, no information board, no leaflets, nothing on any wall to indicate that these important events took place in this very ancient town, in this vicinity. And neither, more importantly and more sadly, was there anything to say that young Glengarry is buried in that sarcophagus. And I thought to myself, the 1745 Association really should do something about this. We really should mark this. And I took it upon myself to try and make that happen. Because after all, one of the aims of the association is to mark sites of interest, historical interest in relation to the Jacobite Rising of 1745-46. And this story surely and certainly is one of those. So I spoke to Mike Niven, our chairman, who you heard from earlier on, and suggested this to him, and he was very supportive. And we took a proposal to the council of the association, and they readily saw the desirability of this, and funds were allocated, and I set about the task of trying to achieve it. Well, it did take me quite some time. In fact, to cut a very long story short, it took me 2 years. I had to contact and find out who owned various buildings in the area to try and see whether we could erect a plaque. There was planning permission and red tape to be gone through. The plaque was manufactured and had to go back because there was an error on it. All sorts of mishaps blind alleyways and rabbit holes had to be negotiated, but eventually it was achieved, and a plaque was erected in January of 2018, 2 years ago, and here it is here. You can see here on the right a picture of where the plaque is placed. It's erected on the buttress of that medieval archway that you can see, and the medieval archway gives access to the churchyard where Glengarry is buried. And that's a very recent photograph, actually. I took that a couple of months ago, and I'm pleased to see that the archway has been significantly restored by Falkirk District Council lately. It was in a crumbling state when we erected the plaque. And interesting for me to reflect upon the fact that through that archway and in that gateway you see there would have gone Lord George Murray and all the Highland chiefs that day to attend young Glengarry's funeral. They would have all trooped through there for a service in the church and to see him interred in that sarcophagus I have shown you. So very appropriate that it's there, and it's just a few yards down the road from where he was shot, where the shooter was, and where he eventually died in Burns Court. So we managed to achieve it, and the detail of the plaque is as you can see on your left-hand photograph there. The motif at the top is the clan motif of the clan motif and motto of the MacDonalds of Glengarry, which bears words in Gaelic at the top, Crec Ananiach, which means the rock of the raven. And I just sum up and read for you what our plaque says. The death of young Glengarry. Near the spot on the 18th of January 1746, Colonel Aeneas MacDonald, known as Young Glengarry, second son of John, 12th chief of the MacDonalds of Glengarry, was shot and seriously injured by the accidental discharge of a musket captured the previous day during the Battle of Falkirk, fought between the victorious Jacobite army of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Hanoverian government forces of King George II. Young Glengarry, who'd commanded the MacDonald clan regiment on behalf of his father during the rising, died 3 days later in his lodgings across the street in what was once Burns Court, and was buried here in the Falkirk Trinity Old Parish Churchyard within the wrought iron sarcophagus of Sir John de Graham, erected by the 1745 Association in 2018. So we had achieved it at long last, and we'd done two things. We had provided some record in the town centre of what actually happened that day and why it was important. And secondly, we had provided some commemoration for young Glengarry to say that he is buried very close to this plaque, so that his name appears in a way that it doesn't on the sarcophagus. So we were delighted to have achieved that, and we were delighted to arrange a special unveiling day for the plaque. And here are some photographs from it. And we were delighted and indeed honoured that Ranald MacDonald of Glengarry, the current day 23rd chief of the MacDonalds of Glengarry, readily and happily agreed to unveil the plaque for us, and indeed to lay a wreath at the grave of young Glengarry on Saturday the 20th of January 2018. We had a superb day, which started with a couple of presentations in the church hall, one given by Mike Niven about the Battle of Falkirk, and a subsequent presentation by myself about the death of young Glengarry. We then proceeded out to the front of the church, where the plaque was then covered. And you can see there Glengarry himself, along with his good lady wife, Caroline, Lady Glengarry. Glengarry then unveiled the plaque officially for us and gave a very moving, poignant, appropriate and solemn speech to mark the occasion, and to thank the 1745 Association for all its efforts to do so. We also had a service of commemoration by the Association's honorary chaplain, the Reverend Bob Hawley, and also Glengarry then moved into the church yard, and as you can see at the bottom there, laid a wreath at the sarcophagus of Sir John de Graham, and of course, because it was the grave of young Glengarry. Very appropriate for the current chief to be doing this, because of course, not only is he the current day chief of this clan, but also, of course, by dint of his very well recorded lineage, he is, of course, a direct descendant of young Glengarry that died 275 years ago in this place. And then finally, if you look at the photograph on the right-hand side there, along with Glengarry and Lady Glengarry and my own ugly mug there in the middle next to the plaque, you can see that we had a piper present, and appropriately enough, his name is Sandy MacDonald, and he piped for us a tremendous and very moving pibroch to lend additional credence and gravitas to the proceedings, and he did that beautifully and hauntingly, and that topped off the proceedings extremely well. So, ladies and gentlemen, that completes the tale, the story behind just one of the many plaques and cairns erected by the 1745 Association. I hope that you have enjoyed hearing about this story and found it interesting. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.